So thank you everyone for coming. I'm Jay George. My pronouns are they, them. I'm one of the co-chairs for the BSA Access Committee. My co-chair, Tim Hood, is on vacation, but he says welcome as well, I'm sure. We're also joined by Daniel Steger and Jessica Welsh-Cordes for the Residential Design Committee, who we're partnering with today. And Jonathan White, of course, is our presenter today. Before we dive into it, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors today for today's event. So we have 3 sponsors. First is KMA Architecture and Accessibility. So KMA is where I work. Actually, I've worked there for almost coming up on 8 years, and it was previously Kessler McGinnis and Associates for those who knew us back then, but we're a consulting firm and a design firm now that specializes exclusively in accessibility and universal design. Our other sponsor on the call is Diane, and I don't see her. Oh, she's somewhere. She's over there. So Diane is from Envisioning Access, which is a nonprofit in Boston. And I'm going to provide links to all of our sponsors today in the chat so you could investigate further. But Envisioning Access offers innovative technology to provide opportunities for persons living with physical disabilities. And they partner with tech startups and universities to encourage and spur the development of new technologies now coming on the market at a rapid pace to empower individuals with physical disabilities to live more independent and engaging lives. So we reached out to Envisioning Access via Daniel, who is one of the board members. So thank you, Daniel, for putting us in contact with that. And last but not least is Daniel himself is one of our sponsors, and his firm specifically, DGS Architecture and Design. So the chat should have the link to, and I'll repost it just in case, but there's a link to receive AIA-CE credits for non-members. And I'll also post our sponsors. And I believe Jonathan already posted PDF slides and note pages for today's presentation, but I will repost it just in case you need it. Oh no, Jonathan already did it. Great. So I think I should stop talking and let Jonathan just lead the conversation. So yeah, take it away. Thank you everybody again for coming.
Yeah, and thanks a lot for having me. I'm glad to be here and presenting today. Let me get the screen share going here. All right. So yeah, again, this course today is on universal design and home modifications. But before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, about the Idea Center. You know, why are we the ones here telling you about universal design and home modifications? So the Idea Center is out of the University at Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning. We're a research center with a mission to produce knowledge and tools to increase quality of life for groups who've been marginalized by traditional design practices. We've been around since 1984. I've been on the team since 2007. And we're a multidisciplinary team. We do research on universal design. We have held a federal grant on universal design in the built environment since 1999. And we have proprietary universal design standards as well. After the presentation, I'll put up a slide on that website. And so we've done a lot of research over those years. We also do direct research on people with disabilities. And we do development projects. So we help develop wounded warrior housing. We've consulted on the Life House, which is a prototype universal design house outside Chicago, an image of which is on the screen now. We do design consulting, and part of that is home modifications. We've done over 1,000 home modifications where we go out and measure the house, see what they need, bathroom, ramps, that sort of thing, and we design a solution for them. We also do consulting in terms of ADA compliance, working either with a federal agency or with a plaintiff side, or working on defense side, for example, in a fair housing suit. And that side of the consulting is where I come from. So we'll review plans for compliance with standards, at all levels, state, federal, local. We'll figure out which standard is the right one because not everybody actually knows what the right one is. We go out and measure buildings while they're being built to make sure that they're going up the right way, or after they've been built. Usually then at that case, it's a lawsuit or people who just want to make their building better. It's an older building that maybe didn't need to comply with the standards back then, but they're making improvements. So that's what we do as well. We also consult on how to make buildings more universally designed, going above and beyond the standards. And part of our discussion today is, well, what is universal design? And I'll get into those differences. So here's our mandatory AIA slides here. That the course is registered, and the stuff I say is not necessarily an endorsement by AIA. So today we're going to talk about the definition of universal design and the role that home modifications play in improving the fit between people in their homes. It invites you to think differently about design to improve human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. We'll talk about 8 goals of universal design, the beneficiaries beyond people with disabilities, and the differences between universal design and accessibility. We'll talk about the goals of home modifications and the policies and methods of assessment. And I'll give several common home modifications and case studies of those home mod jobs that we've done to help exemplify some of the best practices. Specifically, we'll look at residential entries, toilet and bathing rooms, and kitchens that are more usable to people with disabilities and people who are aging in place. So the short version of that is here's our learning objectives for today. Definition, benefits. I'm actually not going to go over the business case for universal design today. Don't have time. The 8 goals of universal design. Most common types of home modifications, those best practices, and some common mistakes. And identify and evaluate cost-effective means of removing safety hazards and barriers to access. So barrier-free entrances, bathrooms, showers, that sort of thing. And we're going to do it in this order. I don't need to go through this another time. Just a little more colloquial way of putting those learning objectives. I like to start by talking about what universal design is not, because a lot of people conflate universal design with accessibility, and they're very different things. At the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A, so people can ask any questions they have. Put it in the chat, and we'll address those at the end. But first, what is universal design not? And it's not the same thing as accessibility. Universal design started out of the disability rights movement, and that led to that, but it's not the same thing. It's not barrier-free design, it's not assistive technology, and it's not only for people with disabilities. It's more beneficial for everyone. Sometimes it evolves from an assistive technology or evolves from some sort of ergonomic design, but it's an evolutionary approach, and there's really no end state. It's process-oriented. So here's an example from the Hall of Remembrance at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., right? This is a quiet hall meant to be a reflective space. But we can see that stairs are how you access it. So to make it accessible, they added this lift, a vertical platform left to provide access to the space. Now, of course, the lift makes noise when using it, and it achieves the goal of accessibility, which is to provide access to the space for people with disabilities. But it's not exactly equal when you look at this, and especially when the lift makes noise in a quiet space, it draws unwanted attention to the user, right? So if the space had been designed from a universal design perspective, they wouldn't have done something like this in the space. They would have come up with a different means of providing access. Maybe they wouldn't have lowered it at all, or provided some other means of accessing it that everybody uses. And so what is universal design? So universal design is a process that enables and empowers a diverse population by improving human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. In short, the message is that it makes life easier, healthier, and friendlier for all people. And a little note on terminology: universal versus inclusive design. I talked about being from the Idea Center, and you might have seen at the beginning, Center for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access. We take these to be the same thing. So sometimes you might hear me slip and say inclusive design. That's the term that the Idea Center used, but then the federal government was using universal design. I think AIA has universal design in a lot of their documents. It's more widely known. But we believe they're the same concept and can be used interchangeably. Design for all is another term to describe the same thing. Sometimes people try to make a semantic difference between them, but I think the term universal could be confusing because people think of it as like, well, like a universal fit glove sort of fits everybody poorly, right? But it's meant to be universal in the sense that it works for everybody in the universe. And so that's why, the term inclusive seems to capture the concept a little bit better, I think, but universal is more well known. So I'll go back and forth in using those terms, so don't get confused when I do. So let's talk about some of the goals of universal design. We have here on the screen that the definition I just gave, and there's really these three improvement areas captured in that definition: human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. And so within each of those goals, well, let me see where the goals went. Okay, I'll have to pull those up after the next bit of this session here because they're not on this in the presentation. Okay. So with each of those, so there are 8 goals of universal design that I'll pull up in a minute, and that they will associate with each of those improvement areas. But for now, I'll skip ahead to levels of access, and I'll come back and pull the goals up in a minute here. Let me just do that. All right, so levels of access. We like to look at any design project having several different levels of access or levels of accessibility. Level 0 would be your typical, no adaptations have been made, no thought has been given to design for people with disabilities. And this is really sort of your your everyday house. Most residential houses have no codes associated with them in terms of how to be accessible. Then you see 4 different levels on the screen here. And for each of these different levels, you could have adaptable or adapted versions of this. So the first one is being visitable, which if you're familiar with ICC A117.1, people call it ANSI, the accessibility standard, ANSI standards. There's something called a type C dwelling unit. And that is what visitability is. It's really a basic level of access. And I'll go through each of these in a minute to describe them in a little more detail. The next is what we call being usable. And we get that term from the Fair Housing Act, which talks about facilities being usable by people with disabilities. And this would be was like a type B unit, or I know in Massachusetts, I think they have something called Group 1. It's sort of like a type B dwelling unit in ICC. Then you have an accessible unit, which has just more space clearances. That would be more like a type A unit, or an ADA unit, or a UFAS unit. In terms of federal housing laws, if you're familiar with those. And under Massachusetts code, I believe that was called Group 2. I'm not sure. At least it was last year or the year before, whenever I pulled up the Massachusetts standard for that. And then 4 would be inclusive or universal or a lifespan design house, a house that's goes beyond those minimum standards. And like I said, you could have adaptable or adapted versions of each. And so what do I mean by that? So adaptability might be things like blocking in the walls for future placement of a grab bar, or future placement of a seat, that sort of thing. Or in some cases, we've actually seen it done with ramps. So you could have a deck that's built to that's framed in a way that portions of the deck could be removed and could be turned into a ramp and still be under the covering of the deck. And so you can still be universally designed, but not be fully adapted by having these things. Another example might be closets that are stacked on top of each other, that are framed in such a way that the flooring could be removed and a lift could be put in to get between the first and second, excuse me, first and second floor of the home. So that would be one way of doing that. And then you have home modifications, which are more of a reactionary approach, right? The house is existing and you have to sort of figure out, how to adapt it to make it work. And, it's a little different from universal design, because universal design, like we said, it's about process and thinking ahead. And if the house is existing, you're sort of stuck with, these constraints of what exists, right? And then you've got adaptive equipment that can be used to overcome certain deficiencies, either with the home or based on people's abilities. So let's talk about some of the beneficiaries of universal design. Who benefits? The first are children, for providing increased safety and security. Adults, in terms of reducing stress. Older people, in terms of providing support for independence. People with disabilities, of course, again, for providing support for independence. People of various size, statures, or sensitivities. So this might be people who are very tall or very short, people who are left-handed, people with chemical sensitivities or allergies. It's one funny thing that I noticed recently was that even something like tape measures are designed for right-handed people, because if you're holding with the other hand, the numbers are all upside down. There's things like that people don't even think of for stuff like that. And then, of course, there are non-physical characteristics like income, gender, cultural or educational differences, or non-obvious disabilities. People who might have a lung condition or something like that, they can't walk very far, that sort of thing. And then also people in low resource settings, victims of disaster and conflict, people with temporary disabilities, you broke your leg. At the end of the day, we're really all beneficiaries. We all have different disabilities. You could break your leg, you might be carrying packages. Well, now you are unable to open the door as easily because you're carrying packages. You wear glasses. Well, the glasses are an assistive technology that before their invention, you would be considered blind or having a visual impairment. So we all can benefit from universal design. Right now, I'm going to switch back over and give you some goals of universal design. Let me stop the sharing to switch presentation here to get you those goals. All right. We'll share that. All right, so here's those goals of universal design again. Next to those areas of human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. So the first goal of universal design is body fit. And so this is designed to accommodate a wide range of body sizes and abilities. So it's not just about designing for the middle of the bell curve or the middle section of the bell curve. It's about designing for the extremes, designing for choice, or designing for the average, but then you've got some accommodation to get you to those extremes. And so this might be having multiple height desks that are also adjustable or something like that, as an example. Comfort is the second goal. That's within the human performance category. So keeping are the demands of the design within the desirable limits of body function and perception. So body fit is about actually fitting in the space, reaching, being able to maneuver about the space, whereas comfort might be about things like lighting, temperature, acoustics, being comfortable in the space, maybe the chair being more comfortable or the chair being adjustable. This is, a classroom at UMass Amherst. It's got acoustic ceiling tiles and carpeting that reduces reverberation and echoes, which is important in an educational setting. It has lighting that has, there's indirect and natural light that improves visibility without shadows or glare. Movable furniture on wheels that can be easily rearranged to make the space easier to get through. Awareness. Does the design ensure that critical information for use is perceived easily? So this is an example of wayfinding and signage at Bowie State University in Maryland. It supports awareness because the signs all have a consistent graphic strategy, consistent text and colors, and so forth. A smart digital illuminated map that helps people find their way. And then paired with that, another human performance goal is understanding, making methods of operation and use intuitive and clear. This is from New York City subway system, where I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of subway maps will have that sort of string of different colored spaghetti as the map, and they put that up at a station, and that's what you used to have to go off of the station. But now they have the technology to do automated and updating real-time announcements for stops, and so you can see how many stops away a certain stop is. You can see what connections are at the stops, what the further stop is, instead of just knowing, well, this train goes to the last stop, which is Jamaica, and the string of spaghetti to try to figure out what stops there are and how many stops away you've got to go. So awareness is about, perceiving information, and understanding is about cognition, figuring out what to do with that information. Yeah, I can see the subway stops, but how do I know what to do? And then these, of course, would have to be paired by intelligible audio announcements as well. The fifth goal is wellness, contributing to health promotion, avoidance of disease and hazards. And so another example from New York, where they've transformed a lot of streets to provide more space for recreational activities like rollerblading or biking. And they put safety barriers in the street, these large planters and granite blocks to stop vehicles from entering those zones. To help, again, so avoid having a disability through encouraging activity. Then we move into some social participation goals. The first one is social integration, treating all groups of people with dignity and respect. So in this example here, we're showing a socio-pedal seating arrangement with seats that are lightweight and movable. But social integration might be something as simple as everybody can use the same entrance, and it's not the accessible entrance is off to the side, or you have to take the ramp to go that way and come back this way. The next one is personalization, incorporating opportunities for choice in the expression of individual preferences. We like to use the example here of the iPhone, because prior to the iPhone, if anybody remembers using flip phones or that sort of thing and accessing the internet or text messaging or just doing anything unique that we do on our phones every day now, they were the first to come up with this sort of bento box idea of a phone where you could just have different apps, and they used to have the slogan, "There's an app for that," and you could turn your phone into whatever you wanted. You want your phone to help you play guitar better, it could do that, right? Some sort of art app, you've got that. Games, writing apps, that sort of thing. So it really became a tool to help people, rather than something that people had to try to figure out and navigate this complex menu of buttons. And so you could personalize. And even today, there's so much more personalization on the iPhone, like being able to customize hand gestures for people who might not be able to do certain gestures on their phone. To create voice feedback and have the phone read to you what's happening if you can't see the screen. And so there's a lot of customizable technology in the phone that lets people, do what they want, instead of just having, ADA mode on, and it does something different and it reads everything to you in a funny way, right? It lets you really personalize your experience on it. And then cultural appropriateness, respecting and reinforcing the social and environmental context. The reason I show this slide is just to show like how color might change across cultures, right? In the US, a lot of times we use red for an emergency exit, but we also use red for danger. And in a lot of the rest of the world, they use green for the emergency exit because green means go. Green is where you go for safety. And so just an example of how different cultures might view things differently. So I like to use green exit signs if I'm specifying something, right? Instead of the red. And so here we see those goals again up against the definition of universal design and those improvement areas. All right, we'll switch back to our main presentation here. Okay, so like I said, we're all beneficiaries. So now let's move on to the need for home modifications. We've talked a lot about universal design. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll sort of shift gears now and get into, okay, well, how does this apply to existing dwellings, right? So what's some of the need for home modifications? Well, one is that many people cannot afford to move. And you'll see the images of money on the screen here will come up frequently. I tried to come up with different pictures of money for each one, but you know, it's a recurring issue. So a lot of families can't afford to move from their current residence, right? And I guess before I even get into this, I should mention when we talked about those levels of access earlier, you know, most of those don't apply to single family housing. There's really no accessibility legislation that says, hey, you're building a new single family home, you need to make it accessible to people with disabilities. There's some, like if you're building a new home on a military base, well, now ABA kicks in, or you receive federal funding to build this development, and therefore 5% of your units need to meet, you know, UFAS or ADA. There's really nothing like that. So visitability, that type C, is a voluntary attempt, and some places will adopt that type C as legislation, their local codes, that provide that additional you know, access. But because of that, the stock of accessible housing is very low, and so people can't afford to just move to a new home that is accessible. One, they can't find one, but also they want to stay where they are. The desire to remain independent. AARP found that 90% of older Americans wanted to stay in their current homes for the rest of their lives. You've heard the phrase, perhaps over my dead body, are you going to put me in that facility or whatever, right? People want to remain independent and in their own homes. We call this Peter Pan syndrome. That's why we've got an image of Peter Pan on the screen now. I'll never go old. Many people believe, and thus most housing is designed as if people will never grow old. When we first buy our houses, a lot of times we're younger, and we're not thinking of the problems that house might cause when we're older. What if I can't go upstairs as easily as I did, and that's where the only bathroom is, or that's where the only bedroom is, and so forth. And 1.14 million older people with health and mobility problems have unmet needs for supported features in their current homes. Another picture of money. There's little funding out there for new builds. If somebody has a disability, they can't really go out and say, hey, can you give me some money to build a house, please? But they can usually tap into some sort of funding source to make modifications to their existing home. People are living longer nowadays. Between advances in medicine and technology, people are living much longer. The fastest growing group is people over the age of 75. And although that has ticked down in recent years, it's still the fastest growing group. That, of course, means that the incidence of impairment will also increase. That's not to say that all older people have disabilities or mobility impairments, but that the incidence of impairment is higher the older you get. About 5% of US households are multi-generational, and about 25% of US households will have at least one person over the age of 65 in them. or they do have at least one person over the age of 65 in it. And that's actually, as of 2010, it was going up at about 2% per decade. I don't know if that's still holding true today. When we had done that research back then. Older adults are more active. People are recognizing that there are significant health benefits associated with physical activity, especially if it's done daily. Age segregating housing is often not adequate, and the percentage of units that are fully accessible is actually quite low. A lot of times it's about people, they build facilities like this, and it's about, well, hey, you don't need to maintain and mow the lawn and maintain the house anymore. You can downsize and move into some place like this and be around people your age, and it's got amenities, and we have community room and that sort of thing. But they really only are required to do a minimal amount in terms of accessibility in these places. There's the Fair Housing Act, which would likely apply to any new facility, which creates a usable level of accessibility to all of the dwelling units. And if they got some sort of federal funding, then maybe 5% of these units will have added features. So it's really no different than any multifamily housing for age segregated housing. And of course, it's age segregated, which some people might like, but others might not. A lot of times people with disabilities who are not older have to go and live in an age segregated housing because those are the only ones they can find that have places, have units open that, have features that they need. And of course, that's not fair to the young person who now has to then go live in a facility with people that are all twice their age. And last but not least, so there's another picture of money, the high cost of assisted living. It tends to be prohibitive to seniors, with such a high cost. And of course, even with Medicaid, okay, well, you're giving up your home then basically to pay for it, and there's a 5-year look back period. So even if you try to sell your home, or give it away to your kids, if you didn't do that 5 years before you needed to go into assisted living, Medicaid's going to take your house to go into assisted living. So that's not good for anybody either. So even if you can't get into these facilities, it's at a disadvantage. People don't want to do that. Again, that 90% of people want to remain in their home. So what are some of the problems getting into home modifications? The first, barrier to service delivery, there's the piggy bank again, cost. So just like some of the problems that we just talked about, the barriers to service delivery can be cost because they're on a fixed income or lack the necessary financial resources. Not just buying a new home is unaffordable. Sometimes renovating your own home is unaffordable. More money, lack of funding. So just like there's no funding for new builds, there's usually a pretty small pot of money for retrofits. There's a huge disparity between the amount of funding available and the people in need. I don't know if Massachusetts has a program for home modifications. I know in New York, I imagine it's based off the Medicaid waiver program. So I imagine Massachusetts has something similar. And I'll talk, I think I've got some slides on that later on, but so there are some funding sources, but there's caps, annual caps, and then there's a 5-year cap. And then that cap, you don't get all of that money, and people think you do. Like when they hear that there's a cap, they think I've got 60 grand to spend in the next 5 years. No, it's only what you need minimally. And I know in New York, they'll cut certain things off of the list. Like, we're going to build a bedroom on the ground floor. We need to put in a smoke detector. They'll be like, nope, we're not paying for the smoke detector. That's a code issue. The family's got to pay for the smoke detector. It's like, well, we have to keep it in our plans. So there's lots of stuff like that, it doesn't even matter then that it's a code thing. Like we're not paying for that. And the next is a lack of consumer awareness. Most people don't know what is available to them or where to find that information. So the Medicaid waiver program in New York is, people with disability, they have a care coordinator who's coordinating their benefits, usually for a child with a disability, and then they can help them through the process. But if you don't even know how to get access to that there are these programs available, then that becomes an issue. Denial of a problem. I know I'm not speaking every image that's on the screen. This would be from a Leslie Nielsen movie, one of them, where he's saying, everybody stay away. There's nothing to see here, as you know, the world is blowing up behind him here. You know, consumers don't like to admit that they're necessarily in need of assistance. Everything's okay. I can handle this. Which leads to adaptive behavior. This is an image of some sort of makeshift ramps that were set up in front of somebody's home. This person actually had their caregiver take these ramps in and out of the house because he didn't want his neighbors to know that he was using a wheelchair. And so they adapt and they come up with these strategies that aren't really the best solution for access to the house. We had an example where we designed like a model prototype universal design kitchen, and we were having people with disabilities come through and older adults come through and use the kitchen. And somebody had rated it actually lower than their kitchen at home. We said, well, we've got to go see this person's kitchen. And we went there, and it was smaller. And what the person was doing, they had difficulty walking, and they were sitting on a stool in the center of the kitchen, and they were tilting on two legs, one from one side of the kitchen to the other, and then tilting on two legs of the stool to the other to move pots and pans from one side of the U-shaped kitchen to the other. They were adapting their behavior. Now, needless to say, that's very dangerous to do, to be tilting on a stool like that. And so the larger universally designed kitchen, they didn't think was as good because they couldn't tilt their stool that far. And so people adapt to their environment without necessarily knowing that what they're doing could actually be worse, or knowing that, hey, maybe instead of adapting my behavior, I could change my environment. Lack of decision-making authority. Often people with disabilities or those needing assistance aren't always the ones making decisions for themselves, in particular if it's a smaller child or a person with a cognitive disability. And so they might not be able to express their needs, exactly what they need, and they're not the person who's making the decision in terms of finances if they're a small child, or if they're an adult with a cognitive disability, let's say living at home. And then the difficulty in finding qualified professionals is an issue that we have with HomeOn. So that's one is I've got a few slides on this. One is finding people capable of doing the work. And the image on the screen here is a curb ramp that was not lowered to the actual street level. And you can see here it's been marked to be replaced. So they actually caught this one as I was going through. I was doing an accessibility audit of this campus when I noticed this. And I said, oh, good, at least they've marked to replace it. But finding people who are able to design for disability is tough, especially in the residential sector. There's plenty of people out there qualified. They know how to build decks and stairs, and they know how to do bathrooms, but they know how to do a roll-in shower because it's different from how you would typically install a shower. Which brings me to finding qualified professionals with knowledge in accessibility, right? And a lot of times, they'll just say, yeah, I know how to build a ramp. If I can build a deck, I can build a ramp. But they don't actually necessarily know all of the requirements of that, like the slope of the ramp, or that the handrails really should be separate and on the inside of the ramp. And then the measurement is taken in between the handrails, and how big the landing needs to be. You can't just take that 36 and wrap it around that a 90-degree turn and have it work. So that's one part of it. Finding qualified professionals who are able to make a profit. That's a huge problem, especially when you have limited funding coming, let's say, from a government agency to provide a ramp or a bathroom. And they're going to pinch pennies on, not putting in a smoke detector, and we're going to make you source that separately. And, we need to take your bid and separate that out and put this over here. So it's a lot of bureaucratic nightmare to jump through for somebody to not make a ton of money on the job. There's much more room for margin, for profit when you're designing, let's say, a really nice, expansive, high-end kitchen than there is to just convert this tiny bathroom, with the state government looking over your shoulder, right? And then finding qualified professionals willing to try new methods, like a roll-in shower, who are willing to look at that architect's plan and go, yeah, I got that, I can do that. The architect says he actually wants me to cut those floor joists down. Okay. Yeah, we've done the math. At least we figure it's okay. You've got the room to spare. You're going to put the blocking in. And so are they willing to try the new methods? And then, of course, variation across proposals. Anyone who's ever done a renovation job on their own home knows that you can bring in 3 different contractors and they produce 3 different results. One doesn't show up, they don't even have a plan, they just start writing stuff down, like this one that says handicap ramps front and rear. Okay, well, what slope? How long are those ramps? What direction is it going to go in, right? Then you'll have people that will submit drawings like this, down ramp, just sort of hand sketched on a piece of paper, without any elaboration. Then, of course, you're more familiar with an architect's plan who will, tell you exactly what you're doing. And this toilet is the Cadet 2 17-inch, 1.6 elongated toilet, model number, 2216. And so that's the toilet we're not going to use. We're not just going to put in, a new handicap toilet, as so many people call it. Most people don't know the right terminology, right? And so what could possibly go wrong? What are some of the things that we've seen go wrong on home modification jobs? And before we show you how to do it right. Some of the problems that arise some of them are very similar to the initial problems. One is the cost of making changes to an existing plan. Our guess is sometimes, as good as anybody's with what's behind that wall, in an old house. We can go into the basement and see, okay, there's no chimney going through there. There's no ducts going through there. Doesn't look like it's structural, but then you open up and you find there's something else in there, right? That got left behind. And so the cost of making changes on these jobs is a huge issue, because you've gone to the state, let's say, for funding, and then the state, you got to come back for more. The state approved the project, it was within the limits, and now it's not because of some issue. Another one is lack of communication. We often, when we get home modification jobs, it usually starts with a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, writing a report about what the person in the home needs, what the client needs. And they need a grab bar, at the toilet, because their caregiver uses the grab bar to help the person off the toilet, because they'll never be able to use it independently, but they need assistance. And so they need the grab bar in a different position than the standards might say. Or, well, the person uses a power wheelchair, so they need this or that. They need to get into the home because it's got steps, whatever it is. Sometimes it's obvious things, and sometimes it's less obvious things. But if the communication isn't there, and the understanding isn't there, then that's an issue. When we do these jobs, we get used to these sorts of things, and so we know how to ask the right follow-up questions of the family. But a contractor might not know, like, oh, well, which side of the toilet should the grab bar be on? Should it be on the left or the right? If we're going to redo this bathroom anyway. And we're going to should we turn the toilet 90 degrees, right? And put the grab bar on the other side, because that's their strong side, right? So that sort of communication is an issue. Lack of construction management is an issue. Architects who do big jobs, sometimes their construction management is in their contract. Sometimes it's a different company, but there's usually somebody doing it on a big building. When it's residential, nobody's paying for that. Nobody wants to. If it's a job where we're getting paid, $800 or $1,000, well, we're not driving an hour to go do construction management under that, for that fee, right? And so that can become an issue. It's really, up to the family and the service coordinators and all that, taking our plans and making sure it gets done. And lack of post-occupancy evaluation. Sometimes again, there's no money to go back and ask, hey, we've done this job, it's been a year, you've been using the ramp, how do you like it, how's it working out? There's nobody to pay for us to go do that. Now actually they have started paying for that. I think they're seeing the benefits of it, and they're willing to pay for that now. So we have started doing some of these jobs. What could possibly go wrong? So this was a job we were not involved with. I'm thankful to say. This is an image of a ramp pulling away from a house, coming straight out. And then it gets to the street and they just added a bunch of stairs to the bottom because somebody told them this was a state funded job. I don't know how this got through. Nowadays, it would never make it. The state had paid for this. They had actually brought my boss out to show them because they were in the area of a job my boss was going to go do. And they brought him by, oh, they just finished this ramp at this house. Let's go take a look at it. And brought him there and saw this and went, oh, no. This was for a person who used a wheelchair. I'd like to think that the builder didn't know that. They were told you need to build a 1 to 12 ramp. And so they did. And they got to the end and said, oh, well, I'm out of room. I guess I'll put some stairs on it. Another one we've seen moving around. This is an image of a ramp just going straight up to a door. No railings, nothing to prevent you from falling off the side. And then no real easy way to open that screen door without rolling backwards down the ramp. And this is another one, kind of similar idea here. This one does have railings, sort of. This one was a job that we were going to do. Dad said, I know construction. I'm not going to deal with this whole process because I know how to do it. And this is what he built. So the ramp is made out of plywood, so it's not going to last and it's going to be slippery. The railings, of course, awfully tight. And again, opening that screen door, it will be tough for anybody, even if the person with the wheelchair is not the person doing it. Well, if you're behind the person in the wheelchair, it's pretty tough to reach over them to open that door. Another ramp with a step at the bottom. This was a state group home. So it has that same problem. You know, people don't seem to realize you gotta have that landing, a top landing. You can't just roll up to the door. And then this is a driveway that it just dumps people into with this step here into the driveway. You know, it's almost funny to like look at some of these pictures, but for every one of these, this is somebody whose needs were not met and whose money got wasted. You know, and I don't know the outcome of every one of these to know, okay, well, did they hold the contractor accountable? Or they rebuild it? How did this even happen? I don't know the answer to this particular one. But I showed you the list of all the things that, you know, lack of construction management, et cetera. That's one of those is the reason for these things that went wrong. So let's talk a little bit now about the home modifications process. Usually we start with a collaborative process. Our nice stock photo here of people collaborating. But that's centered around the client. So typically you have a care coordinator, an occupational therapist, an architect, and contractor, right? Those are really the big four, and of course the family. Sometimes there's more than that. Sometimes it's, well, the family or the property owner too, because it might be a rental or rent to own. I've seen in some cases. Sometimes the client and family have different ideas themselves. The person in the family versus the owner of the home have a different idea of what they want. So it's really important to make sure that at the beginning, it's not just the architect going up to somebody, because the architect's not like a medical professional, right? Even, I might be able, if we've done over 1,000 ideas centers, so maybe we're somebody who might be able to go in and sort of figure out what somebody needs based on their abilities. But it's really the physical therapist or occupational therapist gives that justification letter. And in terms of when it's state funding in New York anyway, that's required that the states, unless the medical professional says this person needs a ramp, they're not going to get one just because the architect said, well, they're using a wheelchair, clearly. That's not usually good enough, right? But it does also help us make decisions along the way. So we all have to be on the same page there. So like I said, it usually starts with the project being initiated by some sort of care coordinator. Sometimes it's just private family contacts us. They don't have a care coordinator because they're going to pay out of pocket. They've got the money, right? But the care coordinator usually comes in when they don't have the money and it's going to be a Medicare waiver or a Medicaid waiver, I forget. Then a functional needs assessment is done by that OT or PT who determines what they need. What are the problems? Sometimes we build stuff for caregivers just as much as we would for the person who needs help. So if it's because mom or dad is currently 60 years old and they're carrying this person who's getting older up the stairs every day, or they have to carry them or the toilet themselves, and so they need grab bars or assistance to be able to do that. So the functional needs assessment happens, then that's where the architect comes in and does a building assessment. Sometimes those can be done at the same time. And there's pros and cons to doing it at the same time or having them done separately. When they're done separately, the OT or PT really comes up with a detailed report that says, this is what this person needs. We need a door here, we need this, we need that. Sometimes some of them have gotten pretty good and they're really specific because they've started to memorize, they know the dimensions and that sort of thing for accessibility. And others just say, look, just provide an accessible, ramp or lift to enter the home. So it's nice as an architect to have that ahead of time. You can plan for it. You can look and see. You can check off everything on the list. Are we accomplishing all the things here? But there is something to be said for doing it at the same time, in that you can communicate with the PT and OT and sort of get a better understanding of what's really needed. You can stand there and talk to them and point at things and all work together. The problem then becomes it's more of a logistical issue trying to get the plans and the wording of the report to match, because now there's a disconnect. Even though you were both on site together, you go separate and write your report separately, and now there's this coordination issue there. So either way, you got to coordinate. Then the architect does the design. The client, sometimes with the help of the care coordinator or the funding agency, will help select a contractor. Sometimes they maintain a list of sort of do not hires. If it's state funded, they have to get 3 bids. And they got to look for MBE sort of things. And then the contractor builds it. And like I said, nowadays we're starting to do some post-occupancy evaluations. They've started funding that, realizing the need for that. This is an example of a functional needs assessment. I'll just pull out some issues here from it. I don't expect everybody to be able to read this on the screen. So it starts by giving sort of, here's what the issue is with the home. Here's what all the issues are and our recommendations. So it says home entrance, the door to the home is 33 inches wide. There's a 2-inch threshold. There's a 5-inch rise from the ground with flat door. Recommendation, provide portable ramps and landing for safe and efficient entrance and exit, right? So rather general. Sometimes they provide the detail of the heights and everything. Sometimes they don't. Main level accessibility. They talk about the ground floor has a bathroom. There has a half bath that they use for toileting. To access the main floor, 5 steps must be a split level house, 37 inches, and the stairs are spiraling at 90 degrees. And the doorway is only 30 inches wide, and so they want us to install a stair glide system. Now, like, those are decisions left up to professionals, because there's certain things about how, like, certain people can't use a stair glide because they don't have what's called trunk control. Or certain people can't do what's called a stand and pivot at a toilet. So approaching the toilet from the front doesn't work for them. They need to do a side transfer, so they can't have a sink next to the toilet. So there's certain things like that the PT or OT might think of. And it goes on and on from there. The bathroom accessibility, they got into a little more detail. Allow for a 5 by 5 foot or 36-inch T-shaped turnaround space, right? So they knew the ADA measurements there, right? I prefer where they are a little less specific in that, because it allows me a little more freedom. If I do something a little different, then they got to go back and change their report, which just adds delay to the project. Here's some examples. We'll walk you through an example of a building assessment that we did. So this was a home. This was the front entrance, so we took a look at that. This was the back entrance to the home, side entrance door. We took a look at that. The height, the measurement, distance from the street, and so on and so forth. This was a child with a disability, needed to be able to get to the school bus. So this is an image of what we did, a floor plan showing the front and back entrance to the home. We designed a ramp that runs along the driveway, rather long ramp because it was pretty high elevation change. And we built a new porch on the back. So we left the front intact and we built a new porch in the back. Why did we do it that way? Well, we had to look at the distance to the street and we knew we had a certain height. And so we said, well, we've got that issue to contend with. Also, the state doesn't really pay to pave driveways. So we said, well, if we can get them closer to the street with this longer ramp, if we did a ramp out the front, they would have ended further back on the driveway. We would have had to do a switchback ramp. They would have been further back on the driveway. And then they would have this gravel. So we said, well, we can have them go out the back door and go straight out to the road and get them closer to the road that way. Then there's contractor selection. People are familiar with different bids and stuff. So just 3 different examples of bids. I won't bore you with that. The construction, this is different. We didn't have during construction photos of that last house I showed you. So this is a different one. But I'm sure you're familiar with it. What this sort of thing looks like. And then this is a final image of that house. You know, a few things they did a little bit wrong here. The railing isn't quite perfect. You know, at least they did do a separate railing off to the side like that, but it really should have sort of metal hooks underneath to be uninterrupted. The kid he was crawling around when they did that. I think it looks like they actually rebuilt the front porch on here too. Maybe they did that separately or something. Oh, I think I had pointed out there was a, this particular house, there was a structural issue with the front porch. Like there were some rotting boards and stuff. So I think I pointed out to the family at that time, like, you know, when your contractor should see if you get him to fix that up a little bit for you so you don't have any other problems there. This house also, it turned out not to be asbestos, but we had gone in and, you know, it was a pretty older home and they needed some doorways widened within the house as well. And I had seen all that old plaster in there around all the doorways. The molding had already been removed. Mom had started doing some work on the home herself. And I was like, I don't know about that. But it turned out to be okay. Just horse there. So let's take a look at some typical home modifications that we do. So these are the typical ones: site access, entrances and doors, vertical circulation, laundry, kitchens, and bathrooms. I don't know, it sounds like most of the home to you. Today, we're just going to talk about a few of them. You know, laundry, it's really just, is the room accessible? Are they the inaccessible floor, the machines themselves? So I won't talk too much about that. Site access, we don't really do that a lot, even though it is an issue. Again, because a lot of the stuff we do is paid for by the state, and the state doesn't pay to pave driveways. And so that's an issue. We have done some jobs where it's like, well, we could get them from the upper driveway to the lower driveway because there's this major terrain issue. We've built platforms that are like 1.5 stories high with a bridge out to the driveway and then down. It's like, I don't know, it might have been cheaper to pave the driveway for more. So we get all sorts of unique things. You know, the truck can't get down to the front door in the winter because it's too steep or whatever it is. And so they need to come from up here. So here's an example: entrance before and after. They had these metal ramps that they were using to get in and out of the home. And in this case, I don't know why this image is so blurry here. We built a deck with a ramp on it. This home actually ended up getting a really large deck. Even though the ramp was funded by the state, this was an Amish family. And so they decided to just build the deck themselves, and then they got reimbursed by the state for the portion of wood for the ramp or something like that. So they ended up building this really large deck onto the home, and the whole community came together and built it for them. And they saved money because they didn't have to hire contractors. Another entrance. This house was really, the front door was off the grade and really far from the driveway. The state will pay to provide a walkway to the driveway. So we did that. Vertical platform lift. Sometimes, you know, just the ramp would be so long. As a general rule, if we're designing a ramp and it's going to require more than one turn or switchback, that's an issue. So I like to try to eliminate it at all. So if you've got more than 30 inches in rise, that's when I start telling people, you know, you should really consider a lift. Because now we got to put in a 5-foot landing and a platform or a turn or something like that, and it complicates things. Some people are wary of these lifts. They break down, especially in, cold climates, winter, people, have issues with them. We've actually started needing to put footers underneath the lifts. We've found that the concrete pad will heave and then the lift is hitting into the deck. So, in fact, some towns here require it now out by us. And then, of course, there's, the emergency issue that if there's a power failure, there's usually a hand crank. So two people could, if you had help, you could get out of the lift using the hand crank, but it's not ideal. Sometimes we do them in garages. So we'll build a platform in the garage and do a lift in there. It's really tough usually to get a ramp in the garage because, it's always like 3 risers like this, and that's just long enough that you can't usually fit a ramp in a garage without like completely eliminating any vehicle. Sometimes you got a 2-car garage. We'll take up one space to do this. Here we actually change the end of this stairwell here to do what's called an incline platform lift. And so we revised the end of these stairs here to have it come straight down so that this incline lift would work. A chair lift or a stair glide, as some people call it. Sometimes they go right to the manufacturer now for this. They leave the architects out of the process for this sometimes. And same thing with the ceiling track, unless it needs to go through a door or something like that where they want a professional opinion on. And so these help caregivers move people around the house, especially in tight areas, without having to wheel them around. We see these a lot in bedrooms to get on and off the bed. There's a motor that attaches to these that drops down, and there's a sling or something like that can come up. They also make wet slings for dropping people in and out of a bathtub as well. So this is, like I said, one of those caregiver support things. Sometimes we convert. Here's an example where we put a bedroom on the first floor. This was a den, and neither of those doors were wide enough, and so we put in a wider door and gave it a little more privacy and turned it into a bedroom on the first floor. Sometimes we have to do things like this. This is called a swing away hinge, and it gives you just a little bit of extra room in the doorway. So for those of you familiar with, any sort of accessibility standards, you've probably heard the term clear opening width. A 32-inch clear opening width is the minimum requirement under ADA, for example. And that usually means a 36-inch door. But the opening width is less than 36 inches because you've got the thickness of the door and the hinge itself within that frame. And sometimes that's the thing that's preventing somebody from getting through. So you have a lot of houses that do have 32-inch doors, but then the thickness of the door and the hinge is what prevents people from getting through. So you can strap these swing away hinges on there. It gives you the full 32 clear opening. We try not to use these unless like there's some reason we can't widen the door. You've got a chimney on one side and whatever on the other, or it's just too close to the wall or something like that, and we just can't widen it. Lever style door handles we spec on any new door we do. They're more easily operable, especially with people with limited use of their hands and wrists. Some pictures of a bathroom. This is before the renovation. Let's see if I can orient you a little bit. So if you look at the doorway over on the left, straight ahead is what you'll see in the middle, the toilet and the sink. And then off to the right is the shower. So sort of how it's pictured there. This bathroom actually had 2 doors to it. There is another door. If you're looking at the sink off to the left, there's another door. It's a really narrow hall that heads over to a bedroom. But you're looking at it here from like a family room. And so afterward, this is sort of during construction a little bit. We relocated the toilet. You can see the lavatory in the image is where it was. The shower is where it was, but you can see now it's a 0-step shower. And the toilet has been moved to be next to the shower. And how did we do that? We'll take a look at the living room again. You see the toilet is no longer straight in the doorway where it was. we've expanded the bathroom into the family room a little bit here to provide that. I think in this case, they did receive some state money, but then I think they paid for upgrades or something like that, which to me is a weird way of doing state funding. Just personally, like, well, if you can afford this, then why do you, how are you on the program? But, but they allow people to do that. They could pay for upgrades, if they wanted to do grab bars out of gold, they would let them pay the difference in cost. But so in this case, we have also next to the toilet what's called a swing up grab bar. I think they needed I can't remember the full details of it. I think they needed assistance from a caregiver on and off the toilet, but they needed to be able to get the grab bar out of the way to transfer. But then the person needed the grab bar while doing it, and they needed it on a certain side. And so the toilet when it was against the sink, well, the sink was in the way then of them doing what they needed to do. And then this L-shaped curtain rod allows the shower space to also sort of be used as a maneuverability space and turning space in the bathroom. Here's a different bathroom here. I think we were doing a walk-in tub for this one. Yeah, so we've got what it looks like as they were putting the tub in. They took the old tub out. They put this tub in with a door. And we also relocate. I think the toilet was, let me check again. Let me see. The toilet was there. Yeah, you can see this half wall here. So the toilet was there, but I think we turned it 90 degrees. Did we? No, we left it exactly where it was, but we just put in this grab bar. So we got rid of the wall that was a barrier here to helping or to transferring. And we've got the grab bars there. This was all specified by the PT. We can look up the standards and know, okay, this is the length grab bar should be, and this is the height and so on. But we also typically put, what we'll do in our plans is say height of grab bar based on fitting with client, and then typically 33 to 36 to top of bar. So we'll do something like that so that they can lower it or raise it if they need to. And then we've got the grab bars and a handheld shower spray as well. Another image of the bathroom before. Took it out. This is what we used at that first one I showed you where they were expanding into the family room. You can't always cut the joists. Most architects hate when they go into a house and they see the plumber has gone through and destroyed important framing members. And so in the other home I showed you, they were using a pre-manufactured joist system. So I forget what it was called. But in any event, they couldn't cut into those joists. It was like those I-beam framing. In this case, I think it was just something with the just the size of the joist wasn't enough that we couldn't cut them. And so they did Weedy or Redguard makes these products that really they sort of fit right within the thickness of plywood. So the 3/4 inch, or it might actually be 7/8, and then they sort of cheated up with the tile and that sort of thing. And then they waterproof all around, and then this is the final product for that. And here's another before, during, and after of a bathroom that we've done. You can see they did sort of, looks like they sloped the floor just up a little bit here to get a little extra that they needed to get that 0-step entrance into the shower. They also do make rubber water guards. Sometimes, depending on the joist direction, we'll run a trench drain here if we can. If the joist will allow us to run a trench drain, we'll do that here to prevent water from getting out of the tub. They also make collapsible rubber water stoppers, either a T-shape or a little loop shape that can get attached to the floor here that will, help water. The real important thing is just make sure that the floor is sloped appropriately. But that's always written correctly on the plan, and sometimes there's an issue. And sometimes family, they just don't understand. Well, it's not that the water is escaping the shower; you're tracking it out of the shower. Especially if you got a wheelchair, shower wheelchair, and then you see the floor is just drenched afterwards. Well, the person came out and they brought the water with them. It wasn't the flow is actually correct. So, so sometimes people are concerned, and we'll throw in a water stopper if we can. There's another example here. This vertical grab bar, I think, is for the caregivers here to assist. Lever style faucets we always put in as well whenever we do a lavatory. In kitchens, we're looking at just minor upgrades. It might be like U-shaped handles instead of bowls that are just easier to use. Different storage elements. This sort of gets out of state funding territory. They don't like to pay for, they consider this more of a luxury type thing, you know, a storage system. But if somebody's living at home by themselves, they might need this sort of thing. So anything that makes it easier for you and I to get in and out of cabinets is going to be better for somebody with a disability as well. So organizing racks for pot and pan lids, having drawers that can be pulled out. Then somebody can actually put a box or a basket in here that makes it easier to lift everything out. They can put all their spices or all their baking supplies in a little basket in the drawer and pull it out a little easier. Things like this, a pull-out storage shelf, instead of having to reach into those upper cupboards. Or a lazy Susan makes it easier to get stuff if stuff doesn't fall in there and get jammed. State doesn't usually pay for appliances either, but sometimes there are upgrades that will recommend having a side-by-side refrigerator with convenience features like water and ice in the door, so having to get ice off the top shelf and spill it. Front-mounted controls on a range or stove. So those are some of the typical home modifications. I've got some resources here for you. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. I'll go over the resources, and then I realized I never really talked. I wanted to go in just a little more detail on the levels of access, so I'll go back to that slide in a minute and point that out for you. We'll pull that slide up again. But let's go over some of these resources first. So there's a few books on universal design and specifically housing. This pink book here, Inclusive Design, Implementation and Evaluation. This book is about the design process. It's a pocket architecture guide, so it's a really quick read. All the stuff I talked about, the goals of universal design, is all in the introduction of that book. And then it walks you through the process from pre-design to construction and occupancy. It's not really meant just for housing, it's for any sort of universal design project. So it's a lot of talk about public things, but it's like I said, it's about the process. What do you need to know in pre-design? What are certain things that you can ask on a project? The middle one is a textbook, Universal Design, Creating Inclusive Environments. There is a chapter in it on home modifications, and there's a housing chapter in it as well. And there are the introductory chapters to the book do go over the definition, goals, history, origin. It's more of a college level book. The last book, Inclusive Housing, a Pattern book, is more designed for new construction, but of course, any of the ideas in it could be retrofitted if your particular site allows. Inclusive Housing, a Pattern book. It talks a lot more about visitability versus lifespan or universal design. And the whole idea here was to try to fill the gap between where fair housing laws kick in and where they don't apply in single family housing. So how do we make those more accessible? So a lot of good ideas in that book. Of course, you can check out our website, idea.ap.buffalo.edu, to see what we're up to or contact us, projects we're working on. Not a lot about the home modifications in particular on the site, but there is a ton about universal design. udeducation.org if you want to learn more about universal design. We use that middle text, that textbook, Universal Design, Creating Inclusive Environments, as a basis for a lot of courses in here. So there is a course on home modifications. A lot of these, there's lots of different ways to take in the courses. There's like a 10 to 15 hours. I can't remember which one the home mod is. 10 to 15 hour course to get credit. You buy the textbook, you read the chapter, you watch the videos on here, you take some tests. There's some projects to do. So there's like an in-depth version, but then there's also the, hey, read the chapter, take the test, the quick version as well. And I guess I don't have a slide about our This Is UD. If you go to thisisud.com, it's meant for public and commercial buildings, but it has 500 universal design solutions on it. If you sign up for a free account, you can go in and browse the universal design solutions there. Again, they're meant for public and commercial buildings, but they might help give you an idea in terms of universal design or some other projects you're working on. Now, I do want to go ahead and go right back to, let's see, go back to that other slide for a second here on levels of access, and then I'll open it up to some questions in a minute. So go ahead and drop those questions in the chat, and I will exit out here. And I think you're just seeing my desktop now, right? Okay. Let's go back to levels of access. All right, we're gonna reshare. So one more thing I wanted to talk about with levels of access. So I brought these up briefly before, and I thought I had some slides that went into a little more detail on each of these. I probably cut them for time. So this visitable, this type C, that is that single. So the three main characteristics of visibility are an entrance to the house, at least a half bath on an accessible floor of the house, and an accessible route through that first floor. So wide enough doors throughout. So that is it. Then under usable type B, like I said, that's fair housing. The things that are missing from a usable design from the type B or group 1 are things like door maneuvering clearances and turning spaces in rooms. And so that's where usable falls short. Then accessible is really built to, it's what you would think of as like an ADA. It has provisions for adaptability of things and some exceptions for residential dwellings under accessible. And then the inclusive universal lifespan would go beyond the minimum dimensions of any of those, and then perhaps not utilize some of those exceptions, for residential. So that's the only other difference there. All right. So now let's open it up to some questions. Let's see. Okay, so I see our websites have been put in here. Okay, does anyone have any questions they'd like to add?
I'll start if no one has a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right at the end here, you talked about this gap between fair housing and the last level of access. What is being done, or what can you talk about that gap? Because I think that's where we residential architects live, right? We're not being required to do much beyond code widths of hallways and certain things. But what pushes are being made within the industry or within government to close that gap?
Yeah. So there are a few. So visitability was actually one of them. So that type C units making its way into the ANSI was one strive. That came out of a group in Georgia called Concrete Change. I think Eleanor Smith is no longer with us, pioneered that. And so certain towns and municipalities have adopted visitability ordinances requiring all new single family housing, or sometimes, whether they're receiving certain subsidies or they'll give a tax credit or that sort of thing if you do visitability. Some of them will reference the ICC type C unit, but a lot of those ordinances were coming out earlier on before ICC even got into it. So they might have their own proprietary list, but it's really those three key features. Some of them will expand that to a list of 7. I think, in fact, the type C unit talks about environmental controls being at a reachable height, which usually they are anyway. Not a lot of houses are putting them up above 48 anyway. And it talks about having a food prep area on the floor, but no further requirements of that. I think the type C might talk about like a 40-inch width or something there. So some municipalities are doing that, or even at the county level. At the federal level, there was something called the Inclusive Home Design Act that never went anywhere. It keeps getting reintroduced to Congress. I haven't followed up lately to see if it's been in the past couple of years or so, but it keeps getting reintroduced and stalling in committee somewhere. And that would have mandated some sort of visitability at some level for housing. And I can't remember, I'm sure different versions of it have had different levels of where that would mandate that. And so that's being pushed. And then there's, just at the building code level, little things being tried, but nothing, accessibility related comes up or has been successful in making it into building codes. And so really it's really that it's the voluntary approach to visitability, and then, sort of top-down government approach. People push back against, being forced to make their house into an accessible house if we know that the person who's living there isn't going to have a disability. And the argument that we give to that is say, look, you're forced to put in handrails at your stairs, you're forced to put in smoke detectors or GFCI outlets. Like, there are certain things that we say, look, yeah, maybe you can handle this, but not everybody who lives in the house in the future is going to be able to do this. So we have that 4-inch requirement at railings. Well, but I don't have a baby who's going to get my head stuck in the railing, or fall through the railing. Doesn't matter. You still got to do the 4-inch requirement at the railings, right? And so, because if some future homeowner has the house, they might have a baby, or you might in the future, right? And so, all of those. So that's the argument we try to make is like, look, some of this stuff should make its way in, but it hasn't really been successful. The visitability is successful because it's really that basic set of options. Look, wider doors. Hey, who doesn't like wider doors? And they're really not that much more expensive. To do 36-inch doors throughout one level of the home, maybe it'll cost $100 more for the whole house, right? As opposed to trying to retrofit that afterwards. Now you're talking, $1,000 per door. You got to widen the hallway. You got to get the sheetrock guy in there, right? And so and then communities who are, predominantly older communities where they have a lot of people who are frustrated at the lack of housing, that's where you will see some movement on it. And sometimes they won't call it visitability either. They might call it universal design housing or universal housing, but it'll really be visitability. We look at visitability as a universal design approach to housing, because if every house in the neighborhood were visitable, then any one of those houses could be more easily upgraded to be accessible or inclusive.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. I do have, I'll go to you and then I'll go to the chat.
Relative to housing projects that have the 5% of accessible units, I've worked on both housing developments with single and 2-family houses, as well as multifamily, both affordable and market rate. And developers consistently say they have a hard time getting people that need the accessible units to occupy them. Where's the disconnect, do you think?
I think it's that, so a lot of times these are rental units, right?
Mostly rental, sometimes condos as well.
Yeah. I think it's really an issue with people. So there's the adapting that I talked about, where people are adapting, but also people have, if they have, unless they're currently unhoused or in just terrible housing, I don't know how much outreach they're doing. People aren't necessarily going out and saying, you know what, I'm in this house, I'm going to sell my house and move into a rental unit. They've either already found their rental unit, or they want a single family house. They're ready to graduate from rental to single family housing. And so I think the issue is, it's not that there's not enough people there's not enough people with disabilities who can fill rental units. It's that the 5% rule works for that group. What it doesn't work for is for people who want to buy a home. They can't find any accessible homes to buy. And so I think that's where the issue is. It's people who are, looking to live in a house and not rent can't find accessible housing. People who can rent, there's accessible housing, and that's really going to depend on the local market, right? So in some markets, there might not be any accessible units because you don't need to reserve a unit for people with disabilities. You have to, market first to the, hold those till last or whatever, and depending on the jurisdiction. But then those units get filled and they're on the 1-year rental cycle like every other unit in the building. And so that's just how saturated is the market there for that. And so I don't think that there's necessarily, I think between the Fair Housing Act and the 5%, whatever, it's under the Rehabilitation Act, actually, that requires that. Between that, the multifamily problem is generally under control. I'm sure in certain markets, there's an issue just because there's an overall issue finding housing, or in markets where there's just not a lot of, all of the housing is before the fair housing, a lot of older, multifamily housing. And then maybe you start to see an issue. And what the Fair Housing Act does, though, is you might have people aren't looking to get that accessible unit because the fair housing apartments are good enough for them. Because it has, wide enough doors. It might not have the turning spaces and the door maneuvering place, but it's enough that it works for them. But I think, the real issue is in the single family housing market. And also I would say in the duplex or in, townhouse market as well, because Fair Housing Act doesn't apply to them. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
There's a question in the chat. Are you aware of an organization like yours working in Massachusetts? I think there's an Institute for Human-Centered Design. So I think they're in Massachusetts.
Yes, they're in Boston.
Yeah, they're in Boston. I know there's others, like I know of other accessibility. I think, KMA, I think, has accessibility people on staff. I don't know if they're engaged in residential or not. Somebody at KMA, can.
I think the question's more about, are there like funding opportunities, things like that. I think IHCD has, as a nonprofit, has resources to find that funding. KMA isn't nonprofit, it's more like hiring that person on.
And so I think the human-centered design would be the best bet to at least start to look to ask the question as to what funding sources are there. I would also just sort of do a search for it's definitely Medicaid waiver program, TBI in Massachusetts, and see how does that get administered, because that's the program in New York, and I know since Medicaid is federal, every state is then responsible for administering it differently. So what that program does in New York, and I'm not sure if these are New York's rules or federal, but if somebody has an onset of a disability before the age of 18, then they can qualify for this waiver program to get modifications to their home. Now, I'm not sure if that's a New York specific rule on that, but I know it is part of that Medicaid waiver. So somebody in social service, in the social service sector there who deals with people with disabilities might be able to point you in the direction of what are people doing, in that area. Are there any other questions?
Looks like one person has their hand raised.
Sure.
They could just come off mute and
Go ahead.
and ask their question.
Hi. So glad you guys were able to come chat. Appreciate it. I was actually just on a call with the Massachusetts AIA Government Affairs Committee a couple weeks ago, and they had one of the towns discussing housing and loss of seniors and empty nesters from their town wanting to be able to stay in town but not having enough housing and wanting to downsize and that sort of thing. And I asked the question because, having dealt with 40Bs at my previous job, towns always tend to have a little bit of give when they're, if you do this, we'll give you this incentive, right?
Mhm.
With developers.
Right.
If you pave this whole section of sidewalk, we'll let you have another XYZ. And we don't always agree with it as designers, but we don't always get the choice to agree with it or disagree with it. And I asked them the question, I said, you know, you guys tend to do incentives for everything else. Why don't you do incentives for adding more housing that's accessible for aging in place? And they didn't want to answer that question. They're like, oh, well, we can't use coercion. And it's like, I didn't say that. You guys use incentives all the time. Why don't you guys figure out an incentive program to try and get some of these developers who are wanting to build these massive developments of apartments in your house, in your town? You know, why don't we use some incentives, right, within the town? So it didn't go over well. It should have, because they just don't want to say on a recorded video that they accept incentives and give backs and that kind of thing for, you know, lower design standards or zoning variances and that kind of thing. I get it. It's political. But I'm just wondering if there's any way that we can try, or that you guys can try, to help create incentives or like market that as an idea to more towns and municipalities and say, you know,
we've
if
been
they're like,
trying.
if someone's I know it's so hard, but it's like, you know, when designs come into that are being built and then immediately sold, coming into the building department for review, you know, is there a way that that towns can say, you know, we have a design standard for housing in this town going forward, that, you know, the doors are to be XYZ, right? You know, one of the rooms on the first floor should have a closet and be a bedroom that could, even if it's a living room that's in the future closed off, right? That has the flexibility to be turned into a bedroom. I'm just wondering if that's something you guys have talked about, because we talk about flexible housing all the time when it comes to micro units and small apartments and dormitories. And I'm just wondering if that's something that we need to start helping people visually understand and spatially understand, that that's something we can do in housing if we just have a few little things.
That was sort of the reason we wrote Inclusive Housing, a pattern book, was to try to convince towns like that it was okay to do visitability, because a lot of the pushback we would get were things like, oh, but then these nice, beautiful front porches and all of this and that. And we said, no, you can still have nice houses. And so we took the pattern book approach that they use for style, and we said, let's use that and show how you can make accessible homes across different styles and across different regions. And we put the visitability in there as well. And we copy in the appendix, we actually just put a copy of the ICC type C unit in there. And that's why we fought to get ICC to create the type C unit, and really Concrete Change was really instrumental in doing that, to get the type C unit in there, so that towns didn't have to reinvent the wheel. They could just reference that and say, hey, if you get this is the incentive. If you do this in X% of your houses, you'll get that, you know. I would say too, I think the bigger thing, it's not so much the individual homeowner, because most individual homeowners aren't going and building their houses from scratch. They're either buying one that's on the market, or they already own the home and the new standard won't apply to them. They're not going to be forced to change their existing home. And so it's the developers who are building, 10, 20, 30 houses, building a whole new road. And how do we get them to make sure that X% of new houses comply with this standard, or could be adaptable to comply with the standard? They could reference the type C, but then say, or adaptable to provide a 0-step entrance. So now instead of having a deck that's 1 foot below the floor, that deck will be at grade and have a drainage grate or something like that. It doesn't really cost, a lot of this stuff doesn't cost extra. The problem comes in certain areas if you've got a limited site footprint, well, telling them you have to have a bedroom on the ground floor, a bathroom on the ground floor, suddenly that could create an issue, but it shouldn't be an issue, certainly in suburbs where you got these large lots and somebody would, maybe have to figure out, what's the minimum, it's, because there's no one size fits all. It's tough to figure out what that minimum size lot you need to say you have to have a first floor bathroom. But
Well, it's almost like if your first floor is of a certain square footage,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Figure out
So-
the average square footage that accommodates,
yeah.
a living area, kitchen, entry, staircase.
And
you
then
know.
the issue, it's like getting it in, there's, if you do it town by town, it's a daunting process. So if you do it at the
Oh,
state
it's
level.
chaos. I
Yeah, if you
fully
do it at the state
understand
level,
that.
then it's, well, we don't want it to, it's too political then, the state
Yeah.
level. So it is tough to get that in there. I would say, because the state isn't going to give incentives like the town can, right? Like,
Mhm.
so that's where the issue is that the state can't say, oh, we'll give you a break on your property tax or, whatever. I mean, maybe I'm sure there's some mechanism they could do whatever they wanted, right? But it's identifying what those are.
Oh,
based
you
on
could
your
have off the
government.
cuff, off
Yeah.
the record conversations with
Yeah.
so many of these towns and find
Yeah.
out all the incentives. I mean, the things
Yeah.
I've learned from towns and that on how they get things approved. Sometimes it's like, how did you get this zoning variance when you clearly shouldn't have gotten this zoning
Yeah.
variance based off of what other things have happened in this town? And it's like, oh, well, they gave us this, they offered to repave this like main artery, or they
Mhm.
offered to install utility poles or pay for internet to go down the street. And it's just like, you do
Right.
all of that and that's great, but why don't you use that sway to help influence the type of housing or the standard of housing within your community,
Yeah,
so that we
especially if it
stop
doesn't cost
listening
more.
to you, stop listening to you complain about everybody leaving because
Mm-hmm.
they don't have a spot to live anymore, because they don't need these giant houses that are not designed for you to actually, age in place. So that's my
Yeah.
little soapbox. It's just a
Yeah.
little frustrating that I hear that all the time, and it's like, well, you have leverage to do this, you're just not doing it.
Yeah, they could easily reference type C for whatever they wanted, a certain percentage based on a certain number, houses over a certain
Yep.
dollar amount or
Yep.
whatever. Yeah. Like you could
Thanks
really.
for
Yeah.
coming though. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. That Massachusetts, so home and community-based services waivers is what they call it in Mass, home and community-based services. I don't know if one of those will apply to home modifications. But so that might be a thread you could look at for that. And then Habitat for Humanity. Yeah, Habitat for Humanity in the chat here, they do have accessible or adaptable housing. I don't know the details as well, but I know we've worked on some, but it's like local chapters really control things. We've tried to get the national, and I think there's been some movement, and that's why some of the locals are doing it. They might be like pushing it, but they're not like enforcing it, right? But they might be, encouraging, and then some chapters saying, yeah, that's a good idea, we'll do it. So, because I know we have talked about that a lot. We've taught courses on it, and we've worked with our local habitat here to do some of this stuff. It's really just getting past that initial roadblock of getting people to understand, look, it doesn't cost a lot more to do at least the visibility part in new housing. Because that's, we've got a whole presentation on visibility. I could talk all day about it, but, wider doors don't cost that much more. There's usually a first floor kitchen anyway. The only time it's going to cost more, if you really got that small footprint, now we've got to try to fit a lot into that smaller footprint downstairs. The other thing, which is tougher in the north, is zero-step entrance. I could see why people don't want to pay to like put a ramp on a house. And I could see, because site work is so expensive, that if you want a full basement, which is common up in the north, if you have to dig down an extra 2 feet to lower the first floor grade, now that becomes expensive. So that's where the cost argument actually, I think, holds some water. But we show in our pattern book all the different ways that you can design, like I said, design a deck so that you can easily put a ramp on it later. But have that space planned, right? If you build the house right to the lot lines, right to the setback lines, you don't have room to now add the ramp that runs up along the side of the house to the deck later on. So it's just thinking ahead and making sure that you can plan for that stuff ahead of time. And that doesn't cost extra, thinking ahead doesn't cost more. Having that deck built at the door level doesn't cost more money. But thinking ahead and thinking, well, but is the wind driving from that side going to blow the water in the house? Okay, maybe we should do it on the other side. That thought process doesn't actually cost more.
All right. Thank you everyone for all the great questions, and Jonathan, thank you for a great presentation. Yeah, thank you for staying a little bit after everybody to listen in. But I think, oh yeah, we have someone from Habitat, expand all the housing. Awesome. Thank you, Michaela.
Oh, that didn't go to everybody. I don't have.
Oh, I'm sorry. So someone said that they were the architecture and sustainability design coordinator at Habitat. Thank you for noticing. We are still trying to expand to all housing. You can reach out if you ever want details. I might, just because I'm curious. So thank you, Michaela, for letting me know. Yeah, but let's let everyone go. Daniel, I don't know if you have anything else to say, but thank you everyone, and thank you to our sponsors for making this possible.
Yeah, that was basically it. But thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Accessibility Knowledge Committee. And thank you to our sponsors.